Great. Welcome, Jill Webber. So lovely to have you here with us today, and thank you for participating in our interviews. And I'm going to jump right in, Jill.
Right. Well, it's nice to be here, Jason. Thanks.
Oh, well, thank you. And I'm going to ask you to tell us how you came to England, because your accent gives things away as you being North American. So could you tell us, and because this is an oral history in some ways, could you tell us your date of birth and where you were born, Jill?
Date of birth. Do I have to tell you how old I am? Oh, yeah. No.
No one will know.
I know.
If it's a long time, and no one will figure it out.
That's right. November 26, 1970, which means this is a big year for me. I was born in Vancouver, Canada.
Right, Vancouver, Canada. So on the west side of Canada. Yes?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Great. My eldest daughter has fallen in love with a Canadian who's from Toronto. So she's threatening to emigrate there at some point. Easily been brushing up on.
Not a bad country to live in. It's pretty great.
Yeah. So you're born in Canada and you're here. Could you tell us a bit about your family background in Canada? Can we start with your grandparents? What do you remember?
Yeah. Sure. I'll talk about my maternal grandparents first. So my mother's parents were Australian. So I'm actually a dual citizen. I'm Canadian and Australian, living in the UK. Just a Commonwealth kind of girl. And so my grandfather was a trade commissioner, an Australian trade commissioner. And so my mother grew up in diplomatic enclaves all over the world. So every 4 years, he and my grandmother would be diplomatically, sent to different places. And so, so that was kind of exciting. They were very elegant. I remember, so he was a diplomat, she was a diplomat's wife, which was a full-time profession. And I have this beautiful memory. I was visiting them in Australia when I was 14, and they ballroom danced. And of course, back in the day in the diplomatic corps, that was an art form. That was part of the job. And they were just so elegant. And I remember too, because of, the diplomatic work that they did, they ate with royalty. And my mom had these white gloves that she wore. Says, I've eaten with the Queen twice, she said. And I remember when I visited my grandparents when I was 14, there was a great debate because we found out that the Queen had actually picked up a chicken leg and eaten it with her fingers. So there was this huge debate as to whether or not that was appropriate, because my grandfather would eat a banana with a knife and a fork. So we had all the cutlery set up just so, and outside in and all of that. And so Mom grew up all over the world. And growing up in a diplomatic enclave, when she got married, she knew how to cook scrambled eggs. That was pretty much it. Anyway, so that was my grandfather. He was charming, he was elegant, and served the Australian government all over. And my grandmother did it with him, and they were home based in Australia. They were posted to Canada when my mother was in her early 20s, and there she met my dad. And so my father's parents were probably, when we're talking chalk and cheese, so my grandfather on my dad's side was a Navy man and spent the Second World War in little corvettes, which are little attack ships, tootling around the Atlantic Ocean, trying to blow up submarines. And so he had like Navy tattoos, and he was crusty and funny and irreverent and just total salt of the earth kind of guy. My grandmother was amazing because she was a war bride back in the day. And so what they did with the war brides is she married Grandpa and then was stationed in Halifax on the East Coast in these terrible shanty towns. They put as all the guys shipped out in the Navy, all of these brides lived in horrific conditions in little shacks by the port in Halifax. And so she was this resourceful, pioneering type woman. When the war was over, Eventually, they moved to the West Coast. My grandfather then became the fire chief at a local pulp and paper mill, and my grandmother became the secretary of a local primary school. And Grandpa also drove oil trucks. So you've got the diplomat, and you got the cussing sailor guy who drove oil trucks. And but I think one piece that's important for me around that heritage with my grandmother on my dad's side was she had this most amazing gift of hospitality. So her home was everybody's home, you know, and they adopted a friend of my father's who basically became sort of their fourth son. And so we always knew that Grandma Essex's door was open, and so much so that she even had on her front porch, she'd made all these little cat houses for the local feral cats. She had this whole collection of feral cats who found their home with her. She continued to be sort of a pioneering type woman. They were on the West Coast in the interior of BC, up in what they call the Caribou region, which was ranch country. So deep snow, -40 in the winter, big gardens, and this log cabin on the edge of a lake with moose walking through the backyard and grizzly bears. And so she was just super resourceful. And yeah, I have a lot of memories of that cabin, and a lot of respect for her. So those were my grandparents.
Wow. So moving a little closer to home with your parents, it's quite common that people are temperamentally have things in common with their parents, or often they can seem quite different to them. And there's already some rich differences in personality you've sketched out with your grandparents. What were things like with your parents? Which ones do you take after?
I feel like I've been blessed to be an amalgam of both. Of course, mom and dad met at the University of British Columbia, and fell in love. And then grandma and grandpa sent mom to England to do some more schooling. Then dad proposed via mail, and she came back. And due to immigration stuff, I think they were
by letter.
By letter, yes, by letter.
I'm sure that's happened, but I've not.
Yeah.
The first person.
But because of immigration, they were engaged like in country for about 6 days. Anyway, so they got married, and my mom was a television producer. Well, she was a stay-at-home mom until I was about 10, and then worked for CBC, which is the Canadian equivalent of the BBC. And she was amazing because she started as a secretary. So she just sat at a desk doing secretary stuff. She went back to school. She got a degree in political science, and worked her way up to being the executive producer of their noon hour live current affairs television show, which she then produced for years and years and years. So daily live television. And so that was very intense, fast paced. So she's just sharp and creative. And then my father was in sort of middle upper management with a life insurance company. And my dad is where she's an activist, feisty, you know, she gets stuff done. Dad is sort of a contemplative, a mystic, quiet, low key. So I feel like for my mom, I got sort of the, you know, getting stuff done, the confidence. She was quite feminist. And so I grew up with no hesitation. I knew that as a girl, I could do anything. You know, I hadn't been indoctrinated otherwise. And in fact, actually, my mother's sisters, we called it, her maiden name was Allen, and we called them the Allen women. And they were involved with international law, nuclear disarmament, you know, all the United Nations. And so, you know, as far as the narrative of our family was like, yeah, women, we just rule the world, basically. So I don't know that I call myself a feminist. I definitely would call myself an egalitarian. I just had a lot of freedom and confidence in terms of, you know, whatever was in my heart to do. There was no gender barrier for me to do it. And so that was a lovely heritage that I got. My dad was a spiritual seeker, is a spiritual seeker, soulful man. I have this beautiful memory. I was thinking about what did I want to say about them. And I have a beautiful memory. When I was a child, I watched a Farley Mowat movie called A Whale for the Killing, which was just devastating. It was about a whale that had beached on the shore of a community in Canada and was dying on the shore, and they tried everything they could to save it, and they weren't able to save it. I remember being just devastated as a child. I just went up to my bed. I was inconsolable that this poor whale had died. I cried and cried and cried. And my dad came up and he sat with me and sort of in a very gentle way, just talked to me about life and death. And I don't remember the words that he said, but I remember how he made me feel. He was this beautiful, calm, non-anxious, consoling presence. And so, yeah, so I feel like I get the creative, get her done activist thing from my mom, and my mystical self comes from my dad's side. They were both in management, and so leadership was built in to me, quite early on, and so that was helpful as well.
Oh, gosh, what a precious memory.
Mm-hmm.
And what was Canada like in your childhood?
In general?
Like,
depends what part.
England. When I get North American friends say, what was England like in the, when you're a child? And of course, I remember it raining all the time and strikes all the time, and strange clothes and people smoking everywhere all the time. But what was Canada like when you were a child?
It was different, the different places that I lived, because the nature of my dad's work was that as he moved up in his company, we would travel and move to different cities. And so I lived in most of the major cities in Canada over my young lifetime, but we ended up in Winnipeg, right in the heart of Canada, which we fondly and sometimes not so fondly call Winterpeg. So in Winnipeg, it's in the summer, it's scorching hot. In the winter, it is horrifically cold, like -40 cold. We would walk to school. I remember walking to school, and I don't know why my parents made me walk to school, but anyway, I forgive them. We would walk to school. We'd have a scarf up to here, and our hats down to here. We had mucklucks, which were big boots with like fur on the outside, and by the time we got to school, our scarves were total ice. Our eyelashes were frozen. And so we just did that walk every day. We were quite hardy, and so I think for me, when we think of Canada, a lot of the time we think of the geography of Canada when you're looking at it from the outside, and you think, oh, it's so beautiful, and it really is. I think what we did every summer as a family, and this was really beautiful memories for me, is we had various generations of a tent trailer or a camper van. And we would drive from whatever city we lived in to the West Coast to visit my grandparents in their log cabin. And so whether it was Calgary, which is maybe a day's drive or 2 days drive, or whether it was Toronto, which was a week's drive, we would do the trek. And so I just saw so much landscape. I remember going through the Rocky Mountains again and again and again and again every year, driving through the Rocky, just incredible scenery. And I was also, as a child, quite involved in outdoor type activities. I was involved in the Girl Guides as a kid, girls clubs. Some people aren't joiners. I was a joiner. I liked joining things, and you could earn badges, and I liked getting badges and accomplishment. It's like, and so we had some really good leaders, and we just spent a lot of time in the wilderness, camping, canoeing. I'm an avid canoeist. And even still, my daughter and I do a mother-daughter wilderness canoe trip every summer, COVID permitting. And so a lot of my memories in Canada are around the outdoors and outdoor adventure type things. We thought the Boy Scouts were really wimpy, because the Girl Guides, what we did was we slept in the snow. So it would be literally -20, -30. And we would build snow versions of igloos. We called them quinzies. And you would clear out the snow right to the ground, pile it back on, let it sit for 2 hours. It recrystallizes. Then you hollow it out. And then you sleep in it at night. And you had to sleep with a scarf wrapped around your kidneys so that you wouldn't get up in the middle of the night. You had to keep your kidneys warm, and you had to sleep with a chocolate bar underneath your pillow because your body temperature was so low by the time you woke up that you had to eat the candy bar to get enough energy to dig yourself out. And the boys were in cabins, but were like, yeah, no, we're going to sleep in the snow.
Is this still legal for young people to do?
I don't know. But yeah, so, and yeah, interestingly enough, my daughter, who's now 27, did all this outdoor wilderness training as well. So there's something in our genes around the wilderness.
Oh my goodness. Gosh, a bit different to leafy Surrey, where you are now.
Well, Canada is, I mean, Surrey is beautiful. I call it unrelentingly beautiful. I was living by the Chanting Woods, and now I'm at Waverley Abbey, which is just fantastically gorgeous. But Canada's wild. Like, Canada's wild. When we go camping, you have to still put your food 10 feet up a tree so that the bears don't get it. And, you know, in Canada, there are things that can eat you. So it's a little different.
We can't think of anything in this country that might do that.
No.
So let's talk a little bit more about your parents. You've hinted a little bit about this spirituality. What was their relationship to Christianity and their attitudes towards it when you were growing up?
Well, we weren't exposed. I wasn't exposed to the church at all as a child. The only exposure that I had to the church was it was back in the day, they would still give Bibles out at school. So I had this little red Gideon Bible that I got at school, and I read it. They didn't have a problem with that. They weren't particularly interested, but and I thought the New Testament was super boring. There was just all these guys talking, whereas the Old Testament had like battles and raping and pillaging and all kinds of stuff. It was far more interesting. So that was my take on the Bible that I'd read when I was a child. And but roundabout when I was 13 years old, my dad really went on a spiritual quest. He was looking for something other, you know, a sense of transcendence, a sense of the meaning of life. He explored a lot of things. He explored transcendental meditation. He explored a lot of pop psychology, transactional analysis. And he was just looking. He was looking around. And at that time, he came across C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. And to this day, I'm so grateful for C.S. Lewis, because Dad read the book. And, you know, many of us are very familiar with it. Chapters like, was Jesus a lunatic? Was he a liar? Or was he really who he said he was? And that book for my father just created a compelling case for Christianity. And so at that point, he just said, all right, I'm in. And Mom just went along for the ride. I think she didn't really have any objections to God. It just probably had been busy doing other things. And we picked our denomination by virtue of which church was in closest proximity to our house. So that's what we picked. And fortunately, we picked this fantastic Canadian Presbyterian church that was very much really down to earth. It was kind of low church. It was, you know, probably closer to what you would see as a free church here in the UK, and not highly liturgical, very community oriented, and had most importantly, a fantastic youth group and some youth leaders who were really, really interested in helping us get to know who Jesus was. So Mom and Dad just started going to church. They started taking me along. And I began to make friends with these weird Christian people.
So it's statistically, it's a little unusual for a parent to become a Christian in midlife. Did you notice any changes in your father, or did he just become more of who he was already meant to be?
That's a good question. I think probably, if I'm going to be honest, I was far too self-absorbed in the midst of my teen years to even notice if my dad was changing or not. Probably he did, but there's nothing that comes to mind. They were actively involved. They loved community. They had found a really, really, you know, you can go to church or you can find community, and they're not always the same thing. And in the midst of their congregation, they found a small Bible study that became a very close-knit community, and they developed some friendships that for them lasted decades, and really primary relationships that shaped and formed them. that bit I remember, and they just really, really valued those relationships. It was life-giving for them.
Wonderful. So, I mean, you talked about moving around a lot. I think you said every major Canadian city.
Well, a lot of them for sure. Yeah.
How did that help you and hinder you? What was good about that for you as you look back on it, and what was there anything that was less so?
I don't have any bad memories necessarily of the moving around. I think for me, I was never a popular kid. I wasn't always, but I could get along well enough, right? I had enough social graces that I could find my place in the pecking order, of where things. High school was a bit tougher, but certainly in the younger years, I was able to find my way. And my brother and I were quite close, so we became this little community of two, that as we moved from place to place, you know, we clung together. Sort of the big final move was when I was 9 years old. We ended up in Winnipeg, and we then ended up staying there for 9 years, and that was quite important. I think I would have found it much more difficult if we had moved that much during those teen years. I think it's a lot harder to find your place in the social strata as a teen, whereas when we were little, it was just easy. You just rock up to people and share a sandwich or something, bring cookies, and make friends. And then plus two, I think the other thing that helped me was I was quite involved in extracurricular activities and in, the guiding and school clubs, school choir. And so I really learned quickly to engage with wherever I was at. And I had lots of interests and hobbies. And so that really helped too, because then I would find these little mini communities of shared practice to connect with people in.
Ah, I was anticipating when you were talking about finding your space, I thought you were going to say niche, but then I suddenly thought, do Canadians say niche or do they say niche?
They say niche.
Excellent. I knew I liked We've got a lot more proper English in common with each other.
I've been in the UK for 2 years. I'm still learning the language. Yesterday I was told that you need to talk about your garden, my back garden, and not your backyard. That a backyard is like concrete and small and nasty, and a garden is a garden. And I'm like, my backyard was beautiful. So yeah, still lots to learn.
It's true. We talk about our front garden and there's not one blade of grass in it, but we wouldn't call it a yard.
Yeah.
It's very, yeah. Well, gosh, thank you for sharing that. So going to move on to your beautifully written memoir, which came out last year, wasn't it?
Last October.
Last October, yeah, late last year, on prayer, Even the Sparrow. And I want to jump right into it. That there's just a very memorable passage where you write about walking out into a wood. You're on a camp, and you say to God, "Hi, I'm Jill." I just imagine it. Hi, God, I'm Jill.
Seems logical thing to do. Like, you were going to talk to somebody, you should just introduce yourself. That's a good way to begin.
Describe what that event. What happened?
Yeah.
Going to that.
Yeah, that's fine. I went to this camp because it was our youth group went, and I went because one of the camp counselors looked like Sting, and I had a major crush on Sting. So I just thought attractive men, fun things, So I went to the camp, and the second last night of the camp, they asked us to all go somewhere by yourself, and it was night, and pray. And the only thing I knew about prayer to that point was we had learned the Our Father at school. This was back in the day when you were still allowed to pray at school. And so I didn't know anything other than that. And so I went and found a spot to pray, just kind of settled down at the roots of a tree. And basically I looked up because I figured God is up. I said, "Hi, I'm Jill." And because what else do you say? I didn't know what to say. And I had the most extraordinary thing happened that actually took me quite a few years to really wrap my brain around, because all of a sudden I wasn't alone under the tree. All of a sudden there was this sense of another, this sort of invisible presence. It was palatable. It was and it didn't feel like super scary other, like out of some creepy horror movie. It didn't, I didn't sense this overwhelming sense of love or anything. I was just like, whoa, I am not alone under this tree. I said hi and somebody's come to say hi back. And I really didn't know what to make of that. I didn't know anything about who God was. And so I did what every sensible teenager does when they encounter invisible beings on a dark night. I ran back to my cabin and just sort of pondered it. Like, what was that? And the next day, so always on the last day of the camp, they share the gospel and they're like, here's Jesus and here's who he is and here's what he did and here's what he's inviting you into in terms of what it could look like to become a friend of and a follower of Jesus. And for me, it was just like, yep, because I met somebody invisible last night under the tree, and the only invisible entity that I could imagine, well, I guess it's God. So sure, I'm in. And it just actually, it wasn't this super, super emotional thing. It just felt like the polite thing to do. Like if the creator of the universe wants to have you over for a cup of tea, you're gonna go, right? I mean, and so that I just sort of stepped over the threshold in that moment into really what I would say is a new reality of awareness of the presence of God in my life. He had been there all the time. I just hadn't been tuned in. And the reality is this man, Jesus, modeled a way of living that was life-giving, and invited me into a way of being fully, not only fully his, but fully myself, that has been just this beautiful unfolding of our lives together. And that probably is my best way to describe it.
Thank you. I'll interject a little bit of myself as we go through the interview. We were actually talking a little bit before the interview, but it speaks to this topic about how, for some people, having a palpable experience of that we would call God, someone other than us, and knowing that it's not you, can be very strange. And I think especially some atheists I've met in person over the years think, we're trying to believe impossible, 55 impossible things before breakfast and the flying spaghetti monster and
our invisible friends.
Our invisible friends. But another interview I've done is with Dr. Ben Pink Dandelion, as an atheist but now a Quaker, that talks about being on a bus. He's English, but traveling across America and having an experience of God. And it's very similar to what you described, his awareness. He was not of just a sense of light and presence, and that it was something that was not him. He knew this wasn't him. I remember I became a Christian when I was 17, had never been to church, and I had a great youth pastor who did a Bible study on the Holy Spirit. And I still remember this, a New Year's Day, I think 1987 back in the day. And there was a prayer at the end that he naively put in to pray for the Holy Spirit to fill the person. And so I read this thing, and I'm a Christian of all 2 months, and I go, Holy Spirit, please come and fill me. And then my room filled up with a sense of light, and it's like someone else was in the room. And I was laughing when you were telling your story, because I had no frame of reference. I put my trainers on and ran to the youth pastor's house and knocked on his door New Year's Day morning, woke him up because he'd been up all night partying for New Year's Eve. And I still remember, we laugh about it now, he said, oh, I didn't know that might happen. that God might turn up if you pray.
These are the dangerous prayers, right? Pray at your own risk. Yeah,
definitely. Ask God to be present and reveal himself. But if I dig into this a little bit with you, as I said, it's not everyone has that palpable sense of a presence. I think you and I, if we explored, which we don't have time today, that we can practice the presence of God, and there's that tradition that you're steeped in. But have you ever pondered and wondered why God said, politely responded to you and introduced himself back then?
I think it's about friendship. I think God's looking for friends, right? And he's just, I think that, I love, there's this parable about, there's sort of 99 sheep all kind of penned in together, and they're being cozy, and there's one sort of wandering off by itself. And he goes after the one. And I think part of the nature of God is he loves the stragglers. He loves to go and scoop up ones who are maybe on the edge, the fringe, maybe seeking, maybe questioning, don't even know if they're questioning. And I think it's his I think it's his enjoyment of friendship with us. Not, theologically we can get, he's a friendly, capital P person. He's looking for friends. That's as I can figure, and I think some of us experience him in different ways. I'm definitely a feeler. And I have friends who are not feelers, they're thinkers. And so they, for them, they would describe sort of an epiphany moment where all of a sudden in their mind, everything just started to make sense, right? It was like, or things that were sort of fuzzy just came into focus for them. And so I think God knows our heart language. He knows how best to connect with us. And so he will meet us in a way that will, he knows the best way in.
Yeah,
so,
he does. Oh, well, thank you. So if we fast forward in your memoir 30 years, and when people ask you what you do now, you sometimes talk about being a prayer missionary. And in a little bit, we'll get to talking a bit more about what prayer is. But I was struck in your narrative on reading it. You're talking about the presence. I put a capital P here in my notes, as if this presence is an answer it's a response to a deep desire for intimacy. That's part of what prayer is. Do you think that's true of you? And do you think it's true of everyone? Or do some people have different desires when it comes to prayer? Maybe tell us the first bit about your job title, and then that bigger question I asked you, the conceptual one about prayer. But you have a 30-year history of your training in being a prayer missionary. And could you tell us about, tell us that, how this has come to be?
Well, that's a good question.
Yeah.
The best way to reach forward. So let's just clarify sort of the current moment. I am the leader of a lay ecumenical religious order. And so that's a lot of religious language. By lay, it means people in their regular, ordinary lives. So I'm not cloistered away. Well, I am more now, but up to this moment, I've not been cloistered away at a monastery somewhere. I just was more of an urban missionary, in different settings, but with a primary call or primary vocation to prayer as the main part of the work. And so a lay ecumenical religious order, regular ordinary person, ecumenical being across the breadth of the Christian church. So my statement of faith is the Nicene Creed. And religious order, all that means is that we're a collective of people who have some shared commitments and some shared spiritual practices, and find that it's helpful to practice the way of Jesus in the context of these shared commitments and shared spiritual practices. And so the Order of the Mustard Seed is formally acknowledged for a religious order to be like a proper religious order and not some weird cult with people sacrificing goats in the backyard kind of thing. you have to go through an acknowledgement process either with the Pope or the Archbishop of Canterbury, or the head of the Eastern Orthodox. And so we got a lot of coaching from the Archbishop's office and the Anglican Church in terms of how to set up the Order of the Mustard Seed and make sure that it was appropriate safeguarding, et cetera, et cetera. And so I helped in recent years bring some shape to that order, and then 3 years ago was installed as their international leader, and just have been invited now to re-up for another 3-year term, bringing leadership to that. So we're dispersed, and what that means is that we're all over the world, and although there are some concentrations of members of the order in different places. So, and then currently I'm situated on the Waverley Abbey estate, which is just outside of Farnham in Surrey, and helping to develop a house of prayer and a new monastic community here. And new monastic is a term that's confusing for some. It's a bit of a misnomer, really, but when we look at the monastic tradition over history, what we would normally think of as monastics, so Benedictines, Franciscans, we would probably call those more traditional monastic. But then in the last, probably since Second World War, there's been a lot of exploration and experimentation in the Lutheran Church and the Anglican and other parts of the church, of people saying, is there a way for us to live into these communities of shared practice where we have some shared commitments and some shared practices? And they call that new monasticism. I was in a meeting with a bunch of traditional monastics and new monastics. We all get together in the UK, go on retreat together to learn from each other. And we finally decided we didn't like the traditional and the new. And one sister, one nun said, we're just all evolving. That's what she said. So I'm an evolving monastic. Yeah, and so that means that a lot of my work over the last 20 years, I mean, has been prayer and creating communities where, yes, we do a lot of urban mission and such as well, but prayer is right at the heart. Is that helpful? Does that answer? My husband and I have moved to Waverley Abbey House, so we're actually living here on the estate, with the goal of building a residential prayer community here. Waverley Abbey, of course, those of you who are familiar, it's the ruins of the first Cistercian monastery in the UK. 1128, it was founded, but then before that, during the Council of Whitby, a local king gave the land for a Celtic monastic site. So there's been prayer here since about 600 AD, up until the dissolution of the monasteries. So it's an ancient well of prayer. Not only of that, though, the Waverley Abbey as well went on to found another 11 abbeys. So not only is it a deep well of prayer, but it's a center for multiplication and resource to establish other prayer communities. And so that's part of our vision as well.
Gosh, wonderful. I mean, a crude way when people ask me about monastic movements in history, I like to express them as research and development projects of the church in history.
I love it.
Like the
That's
Jesuits, so Saint Ignatius, the Jesuits got into a lot of trouble with the church, and did their whole education and mission thing, and the Carmelites, very mystical, and I just picture them as these hardcore research and development projects that bring a greater influence to the body of Christ, and then they become respectable at some point.
And then fossilized possibly, and
the church catches up with them. So if I'm allowed to frame, what's your community called?
Well, we're calling the order is the Order of the Mustard Seed, but here at Waverley Abbey, we're calling it the Seed Community, because we're just, I love, we're not a lot. So people are like, oh, we want to come and see you. And back in Hamilton, when our community was in Hamilton, they're like, come and see. And I'm like, well, we're not really a lot to look like. Just very small. But the history of the church has been radically shaped by small handfuls of people who are like, what would it look like if we tried to practice the way of Jesus in an extravagantly generous way? And it's changed the church over the millennia. And so So we're small. So we're calling ourselves the Seed Community
So
right now,
small,
at least.
but it still sounds like a research and development project there.
Oh yeah. No, we're having fun.
Anything that you feel, and I know you would frame it as, you know, that you feel in your prayer and discernment that God was speaking to you about, or just anything collectively together that you feel is what your focus might be for this community?
Well, I think it's early days for us, and so we're just getting established. I think our sense is that there are two things we're being invited to do. One, a sense of being just archaeologists. There is a history of prayer implicit in this location that has spanned the millennia, and there are treasures to be found if we just sort of dig around a bit carefully and gently. And so that's one. And then secondly, I think there's a cultivation grace. I think that we're we've moved here. We're gathering other people to come here, and we just want to. Do you know what it's like when you move somewhere in the winter, and the garden is just like dirt, right? And then spring comes, and all of a sudden things begin to come up out of the ground, and it feels a little bit like that. So we're just showing up here, and we're just going to keep our eyes open and see what begins to emerge in this place, and through prayer and through loving presence cultivate that, and just see what God might want to do. We actually don't know, and that's the fun of it. So more will be revealed.
It's interesting. I have been on retreat at a Franciscan monastic community, and it was amazing to meet, you know, to be led in retreat by Father, I can't remember his name, and I do. There was just something that naturally occurred. I wonder if it will occur with you, that, you know, it would have felt wrong to call him Matthew if that had been his first name. He was Father. I can't remember his last name. A very hardworking and deeply spiritual, and it was. He tried to convince me that he had a different experience of time to other people, as in that he felt that the more he prayed, the more productive that he became, and he suspected if they put a CCTV camera on him, that time passed differently for him in the kingdom of God. Every time I think of him, I like to think that was true. It's going to be wonderful to see how that community unfolds. I had a friend a little while ago talking about someone else who was a spiritual director, saying, well, it's all right for them. All they do is, you know, pray and read their Bible and help people meet Jesus, as if, you know, sort of slightly disparaging. And I said, yeah, but it took them a journey of, like you, 30 years to become the kind of person that they are. I mean, just that whole topic alone, Jill, which we'll sort of touch on a little bit as we go through these next questions. Yeah. So I did, buried away there, back there in that little conversation, was talking about the nature of prayer.
Yeah.
And your narrative about the presence of God, and this, what comes through in your book, this deep desire for intimacy with God. It's not a flippant intimacy, as I read your book. You know, there is the, you know, the, hi, I'm Jill, but not any flippancy about that. Not Jesus is my buddy kind of thing. And I asked you about, you know, let's talk about that desire. Has it always been with you since you had that experience in the woods?
That's a good question. Again, it was a long time ago in my youth. I think if I was to put a marker in the ground of where I really became keenly aware of desire, it would be 1994 in Toronto. So any students of recent church history will know that in 1994 in Toronto, some extraordinary things happened. I was part of a local Baptist church, and we heard about this crazy vineyard church near the airport in Toronto, where people were doing all kinds of wild things, lying on the floor and laughing and all this nutty stuff. I thought they were crazy. But I had all my friends who were going, and they were like, no, God's there, God's doing something. I was like, yeah, maybe, I don't know. So I went and I made the mistake of sitting in the front row, and no word of a lie, they're like people flopping around at my feet. These were like full on revival meetings. And I just kind of, the experience of like when you're at somebody's house, well, maybe this has never happened to you, but it certainly happened to me in my urban context. You're at somebody's house and all of a sudden you see a mouse run across the floor. You just lift up your feet. that, that was my experience at the Toronto airport. I was just like, yeah, you guys are crazy. And just left. But the thing that got me there was I watched the transformation of my friends' emotional chemistry and consequently their lives. And I was like, whoa, these guys are crazy, but something is happening that I can't understand. And so that sparked in me a hunger. I was in a particularly low point in my personal life, which we may or may not get to, and very aware of my need for more resource than I currently had. And then, so I remember kind of going back to the meetings and I thought, right, I'm sure they're pushing people over. I'm going to these meetings, there's people falling over, they must be pushing over. And I thought, I'm going to go up for prayer, but I'm going to like plant myself on the balls of my feet and brace myself. And I'm like, nobody's going to push me over. And I stood up in the front and I'm there. I'm like, dare ya, double dog dare ya. You're like, and nobody touches me. And all of a sudden the presence of God came and I was like, wham, down on the floor for a couple of hours. And I'm like, nobody pushed me over. And I had extraordinary encounters with God over the course of a number of years of these meetings, and inexplicable things, and an internal rearrangement of my soul, and that, I think what we became enculturated in that revival, sort of renewal revival context, was a longing for more of God than we're experiencing right now. We had a sense, actually, heaven is particularly generous at this moment, so why not ask, for whatever reason. And so that took me on a journey of acknowledging hunger and thirst and desire and longing, and actually reaching for God with an expectation that God is a good father. Because a lot of what got reoriented in me in that season was my image of God. I began to understand God as a generous, as a good father who gives good gifts to his children. And so that gave me a posture of expectation of his goodness and a hopefulness. And so that, I think, was the marker moment for me around hunger and a pursuit of the presence of God. Yeah. And that's never, since then, since 94, that's never gone away. And I would have thought, how many years ago is that now? 94. So that's 26 years ago. I would have thought, well, maybe it'll die down, maybe it'll diminish, there's cooling off period, whatever. And reflecting on it, I'm like, yeah, no, I'm still hungry. And I still have an expectation. All over and over and over again, I keep coming back to this scripture. It's your Father. Don't be afraid, little flock. It's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Right? He's always extending himself towards us with generosity and with a heart of love. And yeah, that's been my journey.
Thank you. Reaching back a little bit, so that experience with the one that you had when you were younger, did any of those influence, if as far as you can tell, your thoughts about that thing of what am I going to do when I grow up? And
well, no, I've always wanted to be a vet. I liked animals, and I wanted to be a veterinarian and make sick animals well again. And I actually volunteered at a vet office when I was in grade 8. I did an operation on a pig, and that was amazing. A scalpel cut through, and take out bits of the pig, and so that was my one career aspiration until I met Jesus. And then all of a sudden, just everything changed. One thing was quite interesting in terms of sort of a before and after for me that I've noticed was in language arts class, we would have to do public speaking. And pre-conversion, I would get sort of C's, sort of middle of the road marks in any of my public speaking. Post meeting Jesus, post conversion, all of a sudden I was getting like A pluses. I don't know what the UK equivalent is, but top marks. And so something got dropped in me at that moment, a communication grace that there was no pre-existent, and so I've forgotten the question now. But
just how what you wanted to be when you grew up, and
okay, and then I decided
you,
I was going to be a minister. So because I knew I was a leader. I mean, I had been a Christian by the time I'd been a Christian 2 years. I was leading the school Christian club, and I just, I was that bossy kid in the schoolyard. It was like, right, we're going to play house. So you go over there, and you guys do that. That was me. And so that just translated itself into the rest of my life. And
I'm married to someone like that. Organized all our friends' lives for them.
Yeah. Well, it's a running joke with my friends and colleagues. God loves you, and Jill has a wonderful plan for your life. Yeah. And so I knew the trajectory was leadership, and the only way that I knew to be a leader in the church was to be a minister. So I had the plan, get my bachelor's degree, get my master's. I picked out my seminary, Knox College in Toronto. I was going to wear the robes and have the dog collar and be in the denomination that I'd come to faith in. And so that was the plan for me. And I did a stint as a youth pastor / pastoral assistant in a youth program when I was 19. So I had already gotten immersed in church work, knew that I had an aptitude for it, and so felt like that was the way forward for me.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to my very next question. So it was so striking, say in your book, you tell this story and this sort of seemed inevitable juggernaut of church experience and faith experience into leadership and into ministry. But then we get to chapter 4 early on in the book that you call Detour, and something very different happens. People, encourage them to read the book. It is shockingly arresting after the pace of the first 3 chapters. And I know it's a sensitive subject, but can you outline that here? What you put in that chapter and what happened to you at that stage of life?
Yeah. So sort of sorry, but not sorry for that chapter. Yeah, I think I start out with the detour started with the phrase, I met a guy. And I met a young man in my church. He was really, really passionate about Jesus. He wanted to tell all of his friends about Jesus. He was a newer Christian. And we fell in love and got married quickly. And then discovered after the marriage that there was all kinds of stuff going on with him that I had not, if there were signs, I missed them and overlooked them. And so I went into a season of 18 months of in and out of women's shelters, a series of assaults, a couple of relocations. If we just move somewhere else, it'll make it all better, and then in the midst of that, got pregnant with our daughter Hannah, and found myself, the final assault happened when she was 3 weeks old. And for what I went back 6 times, obviously 5 times too many, but I really wanted to sort of give it the best I could. But as soon as the child was at risk as well, then I was done. I'm like, yeah, no, I've done everything that I can do in this situation. And so found myself a baby 3 weeks old, without a home, without what I just went with what I could carry, which was mostly her, a few baby accoutrements, and started a new life. But I describe it, it's like I was the World Trade Center on 9/12, right, the day after. And I just felt like a huge pile of rubble. It had been so unexpected. I had been so unprepared. It was so traumatic. And unfortunately, the church was not particularly helpful. The first time I disclosed, the first time I disclosed to my church elders, and I won't say which denomination, The first time I disclosed to my elders the violence that I was experiencing at home, I was rebuked for talking about my husband's private life. The second time I talked to church elders about the violence, I was given a passage in Peter about women suffering in silence. It's just like, oh. And then fortunately, I came back to my home church, my Baptist church, and the timing, God's timing was so good. I kind of came crawling back to my Baptist church, and to find out that they had just started a sermon series on the abuse of women in intimate relationships. And for the first time, I heard from the pulpit that it was okay for me, if I was unsafe in my home, if there was violence in my home, then I could leave and God wouldn't be mad at me. And that was a game changer for me. It was like, okay, that's all right. And maybe leaving will catalyze my husband then doing the work that he needs to do so that we could come back together. That's not how it turned out for us, unfortunately. But I was so grateful that my church was willing to, from the pulpit, wrestle with the issue of domestic violence. And they were tremendously supportive of me as I began my recovery.
And if I can ask, last question I'll ask on this, how did your parents navigate that time with you?
It was extremely difficult. I mean, there was a lot there was sort of two waves of it. There was the wave when I was, first married, and then there was a second wave when my daughter was 14 of sort of harassment, and the police showed up at our house one day, and evidently he called and made sort of 104 death threats. And I actually had to listen to the recordings of some of them, which was a bit chilling because he was quite detailed in his plans. But he actually called a lot of them into my mother's workplace because he didn't know how else to find me. And so I think it was very painful for them, painful and scary. And I was young. I didn't know how best to receive the help that they wanted to give at the time. There was one point where I was at their house, and he broke a restraining order and showed up at the house and tried to get in the house. So it was scary. I mean, it was frightening for them as well. And they were so, in the midst of all the pain, and they were just so supportive. Yeah, I'm really grateful. I'm really, really grateful.
Oh gosh, thank you. So yeah, say encouraging people listening to this to read the book, because I say first 3 chapters chunder along, and then suddenly it's like
punch in the face in chapter 4. Sorry,
it's like a movie where an aircraft flies into the building of this life, and what was going to be changes.
Truth is stranger than fiction, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all have these moments where just something happens.
And happened to many of us. We're not planning it and expecting it. So again, it's delightful and it's true. Move on from that chapter very quickly to you as a single mother trying to earn a living. And I will say this with as straight a face as possible. You invent a character called Crazy Daisy. Could you tell us?
Crazy Daisy? What a politically incorrect name. I could never do that now. It was, essentially, when I ended up realizing I was going to be a single mom, I was asked, so you're going to put your daughter in daycare and go to work? And not my finest moment, but I was like really terse. I said, she's just lost one parent. She's not losing the other one. And just tried to look for ways that I could earn a living and still be with her all the time. And so I was a nanny for years. And then as she got to be school age, I'm like, right, I can do something else. What should I do? And my church did an outreach one day in a community festival, and they were looking for people to be clowns. So I'm like, yeah, what the heck? So they put me in a costume and they did my face up, and I just went out and handed out candies and played with kids. And I really liked it. And I thought, oh, wait a second. I also knew that clowning paid a lot. And so, oh yeah, like this was 20, years ago, I could make
Yeah.
$150 an hour.
Good
So
grief.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Go buy yourself a nose, Jason.
Oh,
A little red nose, off you go.
wow. My goodness.
So yeah, no, it was really helpful for me, and I needed that kind of, because I wanted to spend as much time with Hannah as I could. So I needed something that paid high in short hours to keep us going. And so yeah, I just it felt like one day I just got this sort of download in terms of, here's your clown character, here's her name, here's what the costume's going to look like, here's what all of your various props are going to symbolize. And just like whoosh, over the course of about 20 minutes one day, there it all was. And so Crazy Daisy was born. And I just started doing parties for my neighbors' friends. I'm like, I'm learning how to do this. Do you want a free clown? And so I would go and figure it out. And I was completely self-taught. And I was a musician too. And so I think my main thing was I wrote all these crazy kid songs and would do them at the parties for toddlers mostly. And that went over really, really well. So yes, so for 5 years, I was Crazy Daisy the Clown. My hair was quite long. This is my favorite part of the costume. My hair was quite long, and I created my own headpiece with like wires that came down, and I would braid my hair around the wires. And so when I walked, my hair would like, I'd have to kind of go sideways through the doors. It was really fun. I miss it, and it's affected my preaching. And I just don't take myself seriously. I mean, I'm happy to take God seriously, but my clowning taught me to not take myself seriously. And it ended up, at that time, I also began working part-time for the Vineyard Church. This was sort of post-renewal, and I actually found playing with kids, getting paid to play, was this wonderful cathartic. So all the burdens of ministry would just fall off as I went and sang crazy songs and played with kids and made balloon animals, and yeah. So it was a great balance to tougher type of work. So although clowning could get tough because there were always hecklers. So actually I quite like preaching in a setting where there are hecklers, because I learned how to enjoy hecklers when I was clowning. And occasionally my agent would book me into like 9-year-old boys, which is just like death to clowns. They hated clowns. And I've had some dark days, some parties. So I learned how to be resilient as well.
Oh gosh, I won't ask any more questions like, is there an association that you belong to, and support groups? But
there was a clowning association back in Canada, yeah, and so we would have gatherings and competitions and stuff. So
oh my goodness. Now I know, again, reading the book, Crazy Daisy is eventually retired as life moves on. Now, if I use the phrase life gets back on track, and I mean by that, as I'm reading your book, the calling to ministry, leadership, opportunities for that re-emerge. But it feels on reading the book that even though Crazy Daisy is retired, that this playfulness with you, responsiveness, spontaneous and creative, that doesn't stop. Do you think you were absorbed? I guess, let me ask you the question this way: has Crazy Daisy lived on, or was she, always you anyway? I mean, where's the persona that you put on, and where was she really you?
It's a blurry line. Where it gets interesting was Crazy Daisy had some puppets, and I realized after about a year that these different puppets were different parts of my personality that I wouldn't normally give voice to. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm doing therapy on myself with my puppets. And I'm quite fond of them. I still have them all. They're friends. And it's a little bit like Mr. Rogers and his puppets, So yeah. So yeah, no, I think there is. I'm actually of the opinion that prayer missionaries or monastics, the invitation is for us to be the most joyful people on the earth. If our vocation, if our life pursuit is the presence of a joyful God, and if I think for me, a vital spiritual practice has been praying scripture and learn and doing it consistently over decades. Because what happens is when we meditate on scripture, it changes our emotional chemistry and it births joy deep in the gut of who we are that exists through hardship, circumstance. There's just like this low burning flame that just lives inside. And that's so I feel really grateful because I do feel that I'm kind of a slow cooker that's got joy bubbling a lot of the time. And so I think God is joyful primarily. You know, he doesn't like injustice, right? So, but in terms of the essence of who he is, you look at the Psalms and you look at the ways he's described in his attributes, I think he's deeply joyful. So if we're going to become more like Jesus, I think we're going to become more joyful, joyful, right? Full of joy, you know?
Yeah, joyful. So, I mean, in the book, you also explicitly talk about, you know, living by faith, which I mean, that would be a whole book on its own you could write, and that experience. And you talk about sometimes of, you know, the cupboards being completely empty, and having just enough food for the day, and then other times of quite, you know, dramatic provision. And I know some people, especially Christians, are listening to this might think, oh, that must be, you know, must be so exciting. It also must be a very strange experience. So let me map my question this way: what was it like? What was that joyfulness like for you? Which is not happiness. You and I both know that happiness is about our circumstances. Joy is something else. What was the crazy daisy joyful moments in the midst of the, you know, the equally crazy living by faith and not knowing what was going to happen from one day to the next? Does that question even make any sense?
Well, I think the underlying thing for me, I think that will underline it both, is a sense of being on the adventure with Jesus. I think we domesticate the gospel, and I think there's opportunity for us to live with far more risk and far more reward than our culture and cultural Christianity would invite us into. I think there's something joyful about giving away your last 10 pounds, thinking, right, what's going to happen next? But there's also, I think what's tied into that is the what Ignatius would call indifference, and a sense of being willing to release the outcomes. So if it all goes south and you end up hungry, then that's just part of it. And let's say I've never gone hungry. I've gone for years without getting dental work done, you know, and so there's been other hardships. But I think what has happened for me, you know, when we moved from the UK, when we moved from Canada to the UK, we had everything was in 6 suitcases. And I'm like, yeah, that's probably 2 suitcases too many. And there's this sense of living light. I think there's a reason that traditional monastics found joy in this whole sort of poverty and I, you know, I'm not espousing a vow of poverty, but I am saying that there's a way to live light where our stuff doesn't own us, and we let go of demanding this for something to have a particular outcome. And really, for me, the way I kind of live into it is like, even moving here onto the Waverley Abbey estate, this is a huge experiment. Like, we have no idea if it's going to work or not. We just don't know. And it might be awesome, and it might just be a complete gong show. We just don't know, but we're going to give it a go. And so there's this letting go of what we think the outcome should be. There's this living light, like, how do I live freely and lightly? Eugene Peterson just coined that beautiful phrase. where I'm not attached to my stuff. I'm not attached to my title. I just, uh, I'm just a pilgrim on a journey, and I don't know where it's going to go, except that Jesus is the destination, and he is my destiny, and he's my way, and he's my companion on the way. And for the rest is completely secondary.
And there are some amazing stories of interventions in your book that we haven't got time to unpack today, but I always am reminded that there's a certain kind of life you have to have lived for those things to take place. And often I think we wish it was the other way around. If I had those kinds of interventions in my life, then I'd live differently. And the truth is we don't. But let me press into Jill, if I might. You're very honest in the book, wonderfully honest.
That's because I read Brene Brown books whilst I was writing my book.
Yes.
So don't read Brene Brown writing about vulnerability while you're writing your own book.
Rising Stronger.
I remember looking, and the books came in print, and I realized what I'd put, and I saw the pile of books on the table and went, oh crap, what have I done? And then I heard back, we kind of gave a pre-copy to a colleague, another writer, and the only thing he said was, whoa, you were really honest, weren't you? I thought, oh no. Wait, but who wants to read a book that's nicey and not true?
Yeah, and we're always quick to turn people's stories into hagiography of, moments over triumph and avoid the difficultness of what we all know life is really like, and people are like they're very complicated and complex. And as I say, you were wonderfully honest in the book. About
the goal of a writer is to write something so that people can find themselves in your story.
And you were you were cognizant of that when you were. Yeah. Well, I mean, one in particular, and I connected here with this question. You mentioned some periods of depression in your life.
Yeah.
And from my own experience of that personally, there's usually the people that you meet in life who obviously suffer from depression and suffering from it horribly. And you bump into people, and that's, I think, where a lot of people bump into that until they experience it themselves. Or there's the sort of polished version as an anecdote. I used to be depressed but got my life together, or that's just sort of in passing. And yet in the book you don't dwell on it, but you describe some of those periods in a way that I found inviting to map my own, and maybe other people do. And it's very hard. I'll get to my question in a moment, Jill. I found it's very hard for people that haven't had mental health issues like depression to describe something they've never experienced. I've tried telling some of my friends how bad, because they think I'm relatively sane and kept on working, but they don't know what really goes on in the depths inside someone. So when I meet someone who is suffering from depression, one of the first things I do is tell me how it really is, like all the way down in the place that you don't want. And I've heard you quote, I think it's Ruth Haley Barton, about, is it walking all the way into your...
She says, can you walk all the way into your sadness?
All the way in. I remember on an airplane years and years ago, I was suffering from intrusive thoughts. I've got a disabled daughter, and just the anxiety and fear of her being left one day on her own. And I couldn't stop this thought process, and was suffering from it greatly. And I dealt with it on I remember I've told a few friends this, and then I stopped telling them. I dealt with it by telling myself it was all right. I could open the door and leave the aircraft whenever I wanted to, which didn't make them, endear me to them. It's probably not the best thing to say to someone. I never would have done it, but you try and describe the sheer intensity of those feelings in those moments. And so I guess I'm asking you, how is this woven into your faith and your spirituality? Because I think people make the mistake of thinking that only bright, shiny, happy people who are already, always on top of things are close to God. But you and I know it's the opposite, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you just have to read John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, that book that came out of Mother Teresa, and and her letters in her later years, and I think there's a luminosity that comes. We think of Henry Nouwen, a luminous soul, but he had great emotional suffering in his lifetime, and so I think there's this. I've got another two friends, colleagues of mine, when I was moving to the UK and trying to decide, if I wanted to work here or not. And I met them and I could see the luminosity. I could see the vulnerability. I could see that they had suffered, and that in the midst of it, that they'd found a way to cling to Jesus and to give their hunger to him. And when they step into a place, they change the spiritual atmosphere in a room, because having invited Jesus all the way into their sadness, he dwells in the depths in a way that has changed them and changes the people whose lives they touch. And so whether it's depression or other family tragedy, there's no avoiding suffering. It'll come at you one way or another at some season of your life or another. And I think, theologically, for me, I land that in this whole Paschal mystery, right? This is the way of the cross. This is Jesus entering in, walking with us all the way into our deepest sadness and being with us there and giving himself to us unreservedly on our behalf in that place. And so then that sadness and vulnerability becomes a place of incubation of the work of the Spirit done in the depths, the hidden parts of us. Because I think the transformation that Jesus offers us is not behavioral modification. It's not sin avoidance. It's not, becoming the best version of me. I think the transformation that we're offered is going into the depths with him. And encountering him in that place. And then from that comes this inside out transformation, right? That carries with it Larry Crabb wrote a wonderful book called Inside Out that I read. Actually, my husband required that I read it my current husband, before I dated him. He said, you have to read Larry Crabb, Inside Out. And it was all about letting go of demandingness and what our desired outcomes would be, and stepping right into the heart of our vulnerability. And then God doing something for us in that place, in terms of cracking us open and inserting himself. I'm using words wrong, but there's a fullness that comes of his presence in those places of pain. That's the invitation. So that might be too weird and mystical. It's the only way I know how to wrap words around it. And so.
And it's wonderful, Jill. You tell stories in the book. I see two aspects to your mental health and faith. There's the one of what you would see as God's intervention in providing relief for you. I think you do some self-deliverance, which is always, your anecdote.
Which was as a Presbyterian, I'm like, sure, let's give it a go. I've got no idea what I'm doing.
Yeah. But then you also quickly tell the stories of, times when you've had to stay in that place and find your identity in that place where there isn't relief for those periods that you're going through. Let me press into this, if I might, with you, and I'm being maybe a little selfish here, as I've got you here because of myself. I remember seeing a psychiatrist once, talking about some of my ups and downs over the years, and I said to the psychiatrist, I said, I sometimes wonder what's the real me, the really depressed me that comes out at times, or the me that's grown and is less depressed, and and I don't know if you've ever felt that fragmentation with periods of mental health. And I remember my psychiatrist, who, as best as I know, was not a Christian, and but apprehended my question well, and said, you'll drive yourself mad trying to answer that question. You're all of those things and more. And that was incredibly life-giving, because I remember trying to resolve that, thinking I need to not be depressed, or I need to be something. So let me turn that into a question for you. How have you integrated all those ups and downs into you and lived with them? How have you found the way?
So I think of it this way. So when the wolf comes and growls at my door, which he still does from time to time, sometimes I know to take authority over him and tell him to just off you go, and other times I need to invite him in for a cup of tea and see what he wants to say. And it means to have, for me, I'm learning that, those lows, that's the warning light on the dashboard of my soul. And there's something that my soul needs to say that I've not yet given voice to. And then I think, to giving myself permission. So recently with COVID, let's talk about COVID. I had a near miss with COVID, where I was supposed to fly to Ibiza, Spain, one morning, and work for 24/7 prayer. And our HR policy was, as soon as the government kind of kicked, so this is March, as soon as the government kicked it up to a certain level, all of our international travel was going to stop. And I got up early in the morning, as is my custom, and I checked the BBC and saw that it had been leaked, that the government was going to announce that it had gone to this level, probably at 4 p.m., but my flight was going at 9 a.m. And I thought, I beat the sun in March. And I could have gone, but I decided not to go, because we knew what the government was going to do, and discovered that everything got locked down. Like by Monday, all the airports were closed out of Ibiza. Everything was shut and locked down. And I literally fell apart. I went to bed for 3 days. I just freaked out, because I thought I could have been trapped on an island away from my family for God knows how long. And I think I was really unsettled and shaken by how quickly everything kind of ratcheted up and changed. And just thought, I think the sense of, we had those moments, many of us, in March and April, where we just felt like the ground was shaking underneath us, and anything that we thought brought any kind of stability to our lives was just gone. And so I had that moment, and I fell apart. I ate too much. I watched too many episodes of ER on my Kindle. If I was a computer, I would say I just powered it down and then rebooted it up. And then I picked myself up 3 days later and got back into things. But I had to give myself space to deal with what felt to me like a traumatic experience, and to actually just to be weak and to be fragile, and to let myself quietly fall apart, and for that to be okay. And so I've learned that over the years. I do take mental health days when I need to, and depending on the pace and the workload, I still need to. Occasionally I'll get up in the morning, I'll go, yeah, nothing's going to happen today. and I just I learned my own tells, in terms of when I'm not doing well. And I know that I just need to just cocoon myself for a day or maybe two, and reset, and then I will be able to function better. So that's still an ongoing thing for me. That still is a live reality for me.
Mm-hmm. I love the way you talked. I can't remember the words you use, and you probably can't remember either as you're talking out loud here, but you were talking about, you mentioned your soul and the wolf when you end up in those places. So I'm hearing a story there about kindness to yourself and, rebooting and resetting, but there's that aspect. As you were talking, it reminded me of John O'Donoghue. There's he's written some wonderful blessings. There's this phrase: you have travelled too fast over false ground, Now your soul has come to take you back. It's a very
Nice.
melancholy.
What would we do without John O'Donoghue, eh?
And I heard the twinge of that as you were sharing, that those moments where you end up in that place with depression or whatever it, the manifestation of it is, but it's actually a work of your soul that's taking place, and recognizing those moments when your soul wants your attention and wants you to be different. That was beautiful. So let me turn that into a question, because you've mentioned COVID. That was going to be my next question. I think a lot of people are have been forced into anxiety and depression who normally wouldn't be, with uncertainty and concerns and worries, and maybe find themselves collectively for the first time in a place where they're having to deal with binge watching Netflix and eating too much Haagen-Dazs, and realizing that there's something going on in their souls that needs attention. Because we can stay busy, can't we? Like that John O'Donovan quote.
Oh yeah. I'm just perpetual motion, hamster on the wheel.
And it's not so much that I think you realize it's not just that there's the pressures that COVID brings, but it reveals stuff that's already there in our souls that we may not want to attend to. And I've been finding that for myself, and as a pastor in a church community, saying to people, this isn't just about COVID. There are some other things, that maybe God wants to do with you here. So what advice have you got for people who find themselves in a place where they're going, yeah, I've had enough ice cream and Netflix. How can I let my soul take me back where it should be? What would you, any tips for them, advice for them?
Well, I'm no expert. I find, for me, finding a means of expression, finding a way for the soul to say what it wants or needs to say, which when I was recovering from the domestic violence, I had an art therapist. And so found that really, really helpful to stuff that I couldn't even necessarily articulate, I could draw. And so finding, giving a way for the soul to speak, whether that's journaling, whether, or some kind of art therapy practice. I think for me, the spiritual practice of embodiment has been an important practice. And so by that, I mean, trying to reintegrate where I have disintegrated my various parts of me. And so because a lot of us will feel anxiety or stress in our bodies. It means our bodies have something to say to us, and they're trying to speak to us. And so there, again, we won't go into, but there are particular prayer practices that you can do to give space for the body to speak. And to say what it needs to say. And then I think one of the things that has been really vastly helpful for me has been meditating on scripture, meditating on the Psalms, and finding myself in that story. I have jokingly said, and I've offended numerous people by wondering out loud if David was bipolar. Because it's like, he's happy, he's really sad, he's really happy, he's really sad. So David found a way to give his soul voice. And he walked all the way into his sadness and his anger and he took us all on the journey with him. And so I think when I can't find voice, you just wander through the Psalms and go for a meander until it says the thing that you need to say. And so for me, I think the Psalms have been a tremendous companion on the road of suffering. And has been through the millennia. That's how people have utilized the book of Psalms, right? It's been our lament. You look at the number of Psalms of lament, like as per ratio to Psalms of praise, and then you line it up with Christian Copyright International's top 20, top 100, and try and how many Psalms of lament are there and how many Psalms of praise. We've lost the ability to lament in our corporate worship. We don't know how to do that. I've noticed it more in the UK culture than in Canadian culture. And we have to find way to give voice to the groanings and to help our communities to give voice to the groanings. And so for Good Friday this year, just did a Good Friday. So we just did a Good Friday is a great opportunity, right? To just give voice to lament and invite people in that context to walk all the way into their sadness as a community. And so
that might be the English reserve and the keep calm and carry on.
Soldier on, yeah.
Coupled with the Christian false spirituality that somehow to admit to struggling and suffering makes you less of a Christian, and completely miss, like you say, you know, the extensiveness of the Bible of lament.
I have a spiritual practice that I did at church when I moved here to get people, because you go to church and people go, so how are you doing? And my spiritual practice was, I gave them the real answer. How are you doing? They don't actually, you know, it's your cultural greeting in your culture, right? You know, and so people are totally shocked if you're like, yeah, no, I'm actually really cranky this morning. Or I'm feeling, you know, but I actually practice. I'm like, I'm actually going to give you the real answer. As a countercultural, I'm going to push back against the prevailing happy clappy culture and invite you into a deeper journey by giving you a real answer to that question when we meet at church on Sunday. And so,
gosh, so much there we could dig into for a spirituality of suffering and faith. I think we press onto some more questions about you, Jill.
Please, that's fine.
You're doing well. Now, at this point, wherever we've got to in your memoir, your book, you describe yourself as an archaeologist, unearthing your buried dreams of leadership in the church. And also you switched churches. Could you say a bit about that? Was it necessary as a fresh start? Did it just sort of accidentally happen, that change?
No, I think it's necessary. I think what can happen sometimes, and I could totally, now that I've been a pastor as well, I could see how it can happen. And you walk with people in the darkest moments of their lives, and it can be quite easy, and their worst decisions, right? You see them, and it can be quite easy to take a Polaroid photo of them in that moment and put it in your pocket and keep it for all perpetuity. It's tidier, right? And so I think that that the community that I've been part of was so good at caring for Jill, the victim of domestic violence, single mom, right? They didn't know what to do with Jill, the emergent leader, who actually, and part of the problem with me is that my work has always been translocal. So I've never been called just to a church. I've always had a broader stewardship. I've always had a broader vision, and so I think that can be hard for churches sometimes to navigate as well. So I think that and just as I regained my strength and grew stronger to be a strong, confident woman in evangelicalism too makes you a bit hard to handle, and so I think for me it really required stepping into a different with folks who just hadn't shared the same history. Now I have reconnected with the pastor from that church. I saw him 2 years ago, and it was so good. It was so delightful to see him. I saw him again the year later, and there was this tremendous joy being together with each other after 20 some odd years, and so that was truly a gift. But I think for us as leaders, it's very easy for us to snapshot people and then sort of box and sort them, right? And so I think we have to be constantly aware that God is at work in people's lives, making them new all the time, and that the Joe that you met last week is not the same Joe who's rocking up this Sunday. If God is living and active, and if God is at work to conform Joe into the image of God, Joe's going to change. So you gotta let go of the old Joe and celebrate the new Joe, but that's harder work for the pastors,
Mm.
right? It's
Yeah,
more work.
it is.
So.
It is indeed. Oh, thank you. I want to move on to your husband, Kirk. You've mentioned your second husband, who has a starring role in your book. I suspect Kirk probably needs his own fan page as a result of your book. He's there behind the scenes. He's there making lots of pasta, it seems, in meals, and he's there dispensing words of discernment. And wonderful to see, you know, it just sounds like he's just, you obviously couldn't be you without him. Could you tell us how you met him?
Well, it was tricky, you see, because I knew Kirk when I was dating my first husband. So we were all part of the same church community, and so that was awkward. And actually, the reason that Kirk and I got to know each other better was after my first marriage ended, my ex-husband was calling Kirk to tell him about this horrible woman who'd ruined his life. And so Kirk's a straight shooter. So he'd call me going, "Is this true? Like these things?" And so he'd call me to, and so we just got to know each other a bit that way. And then I was a worship leader at my church, and Kirk was a drummer. And so we just ended up serving on worship teams together, and so that was just a common interest that we had with each other. And so so that's how I met him. And actually, when we were dating, it was really, we were quite conflicted because he still felt this loyalty to this old friendship with my ex-husband, and plus there's actually a sort of a danger factor. We had to be quite careful, so it was pretty conflicted, but we found our way eventually.
So again, I've already asked you a few personal questions. If I can press in a little bit with this one,
Yeah, that's fine.
How did you learn to trust again?
Took a few years. I was pretty jumpy. Yeah, I couldn't handle Kirk getting angry, and it took me a few years to realize that he wasn't actually going to hurt me, and that so I had very little tolerance for any anger or impatience, because that for me had equated always went somewhere else, and so that took time. It took a few years before I actually began to trust that I was not physically in harm's way. So he just had to be patient with me, and that to learn some new ways of being.
And a follow-on, perhaps even more difficult question: after a trauma like you went through, never mind trusting another man, what was it like for you? What was your relationship with God like in terms of trust? Also, what was it like about making important life decisions? I remember at the start of this interview, early on in this interview, you said if there were signs. I know you were a lot younger. I didn't spot them. Did you find yourself second guessing God and second guessing yourself after what you went through?
Let's deal with question 1 first. I actually went through a phase where I could not handle the concept of God who is a man. And because I had been so traumatized by the church patriarchy as well, this church that was more interested in protecting my husband than protecting me as in the violent situation. And so I actually had no time for a male God. And God in his kindness, I remember sitting with my art therapist, who is a Christian, and just saying, "God, like, I can't, if you're a guy, I can't talk to you right now. And I had this sort of flash vision that came into my mind's eye of me kind of huddled up in the ground, arms around my knees, surrounded by this big pillar of fire. Of course, we see God appearing in the Old Testament, and the book of Exodus is a pillar of fire. And the scripture that just kind of leapt into my heart in that moment is, my God is a consuming fire. And And I thought, okay, I can't handle a God who's a male right now. So I'm going to, that image of God, I need to set aside for this season until I get some healing and some restoration. But a God as a consuming fire that offers me that wall of protection and warmth, and there's a fierceness about, I can worship that God. And so I actually had to do some work around it, God image, to find a way of looking at him, approaching him that didn't trigger my areas of trauma. So
Wow, thank you. And then, yeah, for your second part of my question, for yourself, was there any point you think, I trust myself to make the right decisions?
Well, I think the renewal at the Toronto airport helped a lot, because at that juncture, I stepped into quite an intensive discipleship season in a highly charismatic environment where we got all kinds of training on the prophetic and hearing God's voice and this and that and the other. So I got quite a robust education in that juncture that kind of put me on new footing and equipped me far better to attend to God's voice, to be able to weed out what's mine and what's his, and all of that discernment. Really, I got a lot of really great training and discernment in that regard. So that timing was really helpful for me, and really then equipped me to step into the new season with a lot more confidence.
Oh, thank you. We've already talked about your different titles: Director of Houses of Prayer, Global
so many titles,
Global Convenor of the Secret Society of the, whatever it was, an Order of the Mustard Seed.
My friend calls me, I have a friend, Peter, he calls me Amma Jill. I think.
Great. And your job profile, pray and make friends. That's nice and clear. And we touched a bit on what prayer is, but you've got a chapter in your book entitled Into Water, that's about intercession. So at this point, you've married Kirk, you've settled down with him, with your daughter, and then you've got this experience of learning about intercessory prayer and being inducted into it, and then before you know it, helping other people to take part in it becomes a significant part of your life, to say the least. So what is intercession? How would you describe that?
Mike Bickle's got a great description that I really love. He says that worship is agreeing with God about who he is. Intercession is agreeing with God about what he says he will do. And repentance and spiritual warfare is breaking your agreement with the world, the flesh, and the devil. So I've expanded slightly on what Mike would say. But and I went through a lot of phases in my understanding of intercession. Of course, a lot of my early stuff was in the 90s, late 90s. And so certainly in the North American scene, we were spiritually mapping cities and looking at principalities and powers over, so there was a lot that came out of stuff that was percolating in the charismatic movement in the 90s. And I, so I had a season of really focusing on that. And, but then really went on my journey in intercession has been really, I think, quite interesting for me, in that I think what that evolved into for me was, I think the most helpful training that I got on intercession was, and I come back to this again, is praying scripture. And so, say for example, I wonder, when we do our pastoral prayers on Sunday, how similar that is to the prayers that Paul prays in his epistles. And so I found, for me, to become a student of the prayers, particularly the New Testament prayers, and just say, how, Paul was this crazy, he laid foundations, he constructed, he was architected the church. So what was important to him? What did he think needed to be built in through prayer? And so then studying through all the prayers in Ephesians and Colossians and all, like, what were Paul's prayer priorities? And so then how can we, if those are the prayers that established the early church, if we want to see things established, then we need to learn from those prayers. So that became important for me in terms of intercession. I think another important key for me in intercessory prayer was, and this came to me through the IHOP Kansas City movement, because I was fed by various prayer streams, was, I think, the gift of IHOP. Was praying the scripture and those foundational, what they would call apostolic prayers, so Paul's prayers that would build the church. And then secondarily, posturing ourselves in prayer, not as the widow, the persistent widow, but as the bride. And so I remember reading an early book by a guy named Gary Weins called Bridal Intercession. And so if I'm standing before God as his beloved, that's going to change how I ask for what I need and want. If I know the nature of his heart towards me. And so I think that for me has been foundational in understanding my belovedness and the generosity of God, who is both father and bridegroom to the church. And so that was an essential piece. And then more recently have really gone on a contemplative journey in intercession, where when I'm leading corporate prayer, I will primarily pray through scripture. When I am doing intercession privately, my prayer is mostly wordless. And, the scriptures talk about prayers that are too deep for words and a groaning in us. And I was chatting with a friend of mine. I've got a friend who's a prior of a Benedictine abbey. And he said his journey into prayers, he realized that he was being prayed through, that the Holy Spirit was interceding through him. He was being invited into the work of the Spirit as the Spirit was making all things new. And that's been that's where I am in my journey right now. So
you've answered all my next questions. I was going to talk about how intercession and contemplation are usually quite different, and how do they overlap, and what
not so much.
When you say not so much, they're not as different as we might think they are.
Well, I think we think that there's like the sit with your hands folded, gazing beatifically up at Jesus prayer people. And then there's like the flags and the shofars and tearing down the strongholds people.
Yeah,
right?
That's
and we think they're right. And if prayer is participating with God's work in the world, I don't know, some of this stuff's hard to talk about. So
it is. Thank you. And for Christians listening to this, they'll know lots of the terms of reference for what we're talking about, but lots of people won't. I'm just wondering how you would describe prayer to someone who, this is back to early on in our conversation, our local mayor, deputy mayor, someone else has been elected now, came to visit the Dolphin pub that we're at, that you've been to visit. And they were so secular. They were completely fine about everything we were doing in there until they asked me the question of how did this all begin? And of course, it began with prayer. A disused pub inspired by 24/7 that you're part of to meet and pray, and feeling that in prayer that God started to speak to people and say that he wanted to do something there that turned into a refurbishment of this old pub and miracles and a whole load of stuff. And I remember the look on his face as soon as I said the word, well, it all started with prayer, and the atmosphere in the room just went down a few degrees, and I quickly segued into how do I explain prayer to someone who obviously doesn't like that notion. I said, just imagine a bunch of really nice people sitting around talking to their imaginary God about wonderful things that could happen here, and some inspiration came from somewhere. I had to frame it like that.
There you go. That'll work.
Warmed up and smiled and was, that sounds wonderful. Do you know what I mean? It's how do you explain prayer? Again, you touched on it earlier, to people who may not have all those frames of reference that we do?
I like the word conversation, and I like the word communion. So obviously when I try and, my working definition of prayer is conversation and communion. I always mix up the bit with God, who's closer to you than you could imagine, and loves you more than you'd ever dreamed. And could it be reaching outside for yourself for something you don't have within yourself, and just asking? That could be one way to. I know other writers have talked about, in terms of crossover language, how do we access a deeper wisdom? By quietening and centering down. So there's lots of. David Benner is a great crossover writer, and so he's written particularly on spirituality, not just to a Christian audience, but beyond. And so there's a cultivation of wonder, cultivation of awareness, that perhaps there's more than meets the eye to what's going on around. And can we be aware, of invisible realities? That could be some language that could be bridge building and helpful, possibly. And so,
I think I've tried with other people sometimes say, there's that thing inside you that wants to call out of you to something outside of yourself. I think I find for a lot of people instinctively, they sort of know what prayer might mean and might be, in reaching out. Certainly that's the way I found a connection there. So you
can I add one thing though?
Go for it, please. Yeah.
Because this is what we do. We mechanize prayer, right? We mechanize it, we formalize it, and we mechanize it. So when I get interviewed by people, often they'll say, "So does prayer work?" And I bristle at the question, and I go, "So does talking to your husband work?"
Brilliant. Yeah.
And then they realize what a ridiculous question it is, right? This is not a slot machine. This is not a, press button A, cling B, there it is, but that's our tendency, is we're trying to operationalize it. We're trying to mechanize it. We want a universe that we can control, rather than embracing the mystery of the one who is uncontrollable, but ultimately has our best at heart. Yes.
Someone to get into a dangerous relationship with, as opposed to someone to get things to work, or what's the other one that it's like the fringe benefits. People that pray live longer, those kinds of things.
I tell women, here's what I tell women. I said, natural beauty is only going to last you till about 40, right? And then after that, everything begins to decay, ladies. But it's what you focus on that is going to show on your face. You see people on the street who you could tell they're in fear and worry or angry. You see it on their face. And then I pull out the scripture. Those who look to you are radiant. Their faces will never be put to shame. And so I said the other day in a prayer meeting, I'm like, ladies, we're in a spot. So, and he beautifies the humble with salvation. And so, there's something about beholding and becoming. So,
well, they say people look like their dogs over time, don't they? And it's true. Our countenance does mirror. We have mirror neurons. Sorry, there's a little side interest here that we, in terms of relationship and connections, and we do embody the things and the people and the relationships and the things that we're in contact with, and radiate those around us.
Yeah.
Now, of course, I'm going to go to 2001 here, and you've responded to a call to start a house of prayer in southern Ontario. Now, is this on the east side of Canada? So this is near Toronto.
It's sort of middle and to the right.
Middle and to the right. Okay.
So Canada, right in the middle, has got these great lakes, sort of and Toronto is on one of the lakes. But there's this whole, really just 3 hours worth of city, and they haven't done the same good job that you've done here to save the green space between cities. So it just becomes this sprawling urban megaplex. So yes, yeah. So middle and to the right, big cities.
And in a possible question, could you distill down, broadly, what was that experience like, this house of prayer? Because there were several years, weren't you?
It was constantly changing, constantly evolving. It was a big experiment. And I do like the language of experimentation. I find it really helpful. And when I try and describe what we do and what we did, I just say, we just invite people on the experiment of exploring what could happen if we ordered our lives around rhythms of prayer rather than just trying to tack prayer onto the fringes of our lives. What could happen? What could happen if we drew a larger circle around who is family and opened up our homes in radical hospitality so that people who would normally find a place in the soup kitchen can sit around your family table? What could happen? What could happen if you voluntarily moved into one of the poorest neighborhoods in your city and just tried to be the loving presence of a people of prayer in that place? What could happen? What could happen if you take a moving lorry, I think that's what you call them, turn the back of it into a prayer room and park it in a high footpath area with a little sign out front saying need prayer? Like, it's just an experiment. What could happen? Could be horrible, could be amazing. And so we just went on a series. We just gathered people from different churches, and over the course of 17 years ran a series of experiments. I read a fantastic book by a now friend of mine. His name's Mark Scandrette, and he wrote a book called Practicing the Way of Jesus. And so he had what they call a practical approach to spiritual formation, which means it's not enough for us to have that sort of orthodoxy. I'm going to believe the right things. I'm like, we can't just be doers of the word. We got to give it a go. So how can you actually create a classroom or a culture or an environment where people are safe and free to try stuff and to take risks and do slightly crazy things, but with the security of a community of shared practice where we can debrief together and pray for one another and clean up the mess and mop each other up and de-bedbug our house a couple of times, which we had to do because the friends we invited over had little friends that came with them, all of that. And so and so that's what it was. That's what the House of Prayer was. It was this community of shared practice where we tried to just explore what could a generous commitment to a lifestyle built around prayer, mission, and justice look like. So let's set aside the narrative of the American or the Canadian dream. Probably there's a UK equivalent, right? And that narrative, let's set that aside, actually. And so let's all live in houses together. Let's share cars. What could happen if we actually chose a standard of living that's low enough that we don't actually have to earn much, which frees up tons of time to do the stuff that we want to do? What could happen? And so that was the experiment. And so that took different shapes and forms over the course of the 17 years and continues to evolve. And part of the whole ethos of it was, what could it look like for us to be a community that's responsive to the invitation of God into our community? And so, because I think that's where movements begin to, we get more attached to our system or our program or whatever it is that we've built, rather than responsive to the God who is always moving, is always inviting, is always taking new ground and new territory in people's hearts and lives and in communities. And so how do we actually cultivate an attentiveness as a community to the continual unfolding of the invitations of God into our lives, even if that costs us everything, even if we have to completely set aside the old normal that we had become accustomed to step into the new. And there's a lot of heart work involved in that. You have to let go of desired outcomes. You have to, again, we come back to holy indifference. It's like, whatever, let's just, the only thing I'm going to take into eternity is Jesus and relationships. The rest of it's gone, right? So
It will be. Oh gosh. Archbishop William Temple once said that coincidences happen when he prayed. Can you describe some of the coincidences that took place when you had your house of prayer? Because you mentioned some in the book. You may not even call them coincidences, but you know what William Temple meant. When I pray,
Well,
things happen.
Yeah, I think drawing a bit of I mean, there's one example that wasn't in the book that Kirk and I we had, our rent was due and it was a lot of rent. And we're like, we have no, like the early days, right now, you know, I've got a little bit of a reputation. I've got some faithful supporters that have been walking with me for a long time. But in the early days, I'm like, who are you and what are you doing? You know, and prayer missionary, you want us to pay you to pray? Like, that's just, and so, and I just remember this random $1,000 check just showing up in our mailbox, just the day of desperation when we absolutely had to have it. Yeah, I think the hesitancy I feel around this, again, in my response to you, is here's my resistance that I'm feeling. I think what our culture would press us towards is, we need something, we ask God, something happens. And then the ground is littered with the soul corpses of those who didn't get what they wanted when they wanted it, or when they thought that they needed it, and then thought that God wasn't for them. And I think the invitation to us is into the journey and the mystery, and realizing that suffering is part of the journey. You're not always going to get what you want, and when you want it, or when you even think that you need it. And that ultimately, that if I'm letting go of my desired result, but I'm laying hold of the one who is ultimately my reward, then I carry my reward with me every day. And so Paul talks about enduring all manner of hardship, and he was okay, right? And so I think that I think the temptation is to use prayer to try and to create the kind of life that we think we want, or we think we need, which in our North American culture would, that would not include any kind of suffering. So we you know, as soon as we hear somebody sick, God heal them, right? You know, that's where we're going to go with that. And you know, and rightly so. I mean, God loves those who suffer, and we've seen God heal, and but also, as one who's gone through my own seasons of suffering, the way that God has shaped and formed me in the crucible of those seasons has been far more powerful than the seasons where maybe God did answer my prayer and I got my rent check and everything was hunky-dory. But did I become more like Jesus in that season? Maybe, maybe not. But in the midst of my suffering, where there was the how long, oh God, how long, and the so I think that's my resistance to your question. I think that we just really have to push back. I'm really pleased. Pete Greig's just come out. He's done a revision of his book, God on Mute. I've read hundreds of books on prayer, and God on Mute is the best book on unanswered prayer that I think exists in the literature. And so it's just a stunning look at just the mystery of the God who's at work in unanswered prayer, you know. And yeah, so do I believe that God answers prayers? Yes. Do I always get what I want? No. Am I as fussed about particular outcomes as I used to be? No. You know, am I fatalistic? No.
Mm. That's very, very helpful, Jill. Yeah, I mean, implicit in my question, and I could have articulated it better, was that God's involvement and activity in answer to prayer is not just for stuff. That he works and does things, speaks to us, changes us, lets us suffer, and you certainly have all those aspects in your book for us to see. It's wonderful. Can I, we're on the home straight here. Can I ask you about Brother David Peter, who was a Benedictine
I
oblate?
miss him. Yes.
You describe him as this loose-limbed troubadour, this Benedictine oblate. Could you tell us what, you know, all these strange monastic terms? What's a Benedictine oblate?
So
And what, I'm just trying to read my notes here. How, because you talk about, I think in the book, about how you learnt some things from him about the Psalms and prayer and stuff.
Yeah. So a lot of religious orders like Benedictines, Franciscans, would have, so there would be people who are like full on chastity, poverty, obedience, right? And the Benedictine vows stability. So if you join a Benedictine monastery, you're there till they take you out in a box. Like that's where you are for the rest of your life. But then a lot of these orders will offer an alternative for people who want to live into the particular, the word they use is charism, particular way of being, a particular way of life, some shared commitments, some shared practices that are true in keeping to that order, but are more accessible for people who are just trying to work it out in the midst of their everyday life. And so you would there's third order Franciscans, there are Benedictine oblates, and so an oblate would be affiliated with a proper monastery, and would go through a process with that monastery of kind of discerning whether or not this is a lifestyle choice for them. Then there's a service where they lay on hands, and the word that we made up our own language because we didn't know what to call it. We're like, he got obliterated. And yeah, so that was good. And so part of what he does is in the Benedictine tradition, they would chant the Psalms 7 times a day. And so I don't know that he does the full 7, but I know he at least faithfully does 4 or 5. So he's got a little spot set up in his office, and he carries usually a mandolin or something with him, because what he's done, he's a musician. So what he's done is he's like the Benedictines, they chant the Psalms. They don't just say them. They call them psalm tones. So there's actual melodies that are simple melodies that have been crafted to help them to sing their way through them. And so, but Brother David Peter is a creative soul, and so he created like instrumental versions to go with these psalm tones. And some of them are reggae, and yeah, it's super fun. And he's got an album actually, so I should look it up. But yeah, and so I think the thing that I've appreciated, we at our house of prayer, we did all kinds of prayer, and so we would have times where we would come together and he would lead us, and we would chant the Psalms together. That was what we did in this space. And so we would lean into that Benedictine tradition to learn from it. And so I think the thing that I particularly appreciated with that is that they chant the Psalms, and they sing the Psalms. They sing all of them, even the tricky ones. It's like, oh Lord, take my enemies' babies and dash them against the rocks. You know, it's just like, how do you even sing that? You know, the imprecatory Psalms. You know, and so I think what happens is when you're singing the Psalms every day, day in, day out, it just gets into the body and the bone and the blood, and that language. You know, the language of the Psalms is, I mean, it's even from a literature, is just unequaled. You know, it stands alone, I think, in the history of literature, and it's deep soul language. I think the Psalms give us access to all the deep places. It gives us permission to give voice to every part of us, but constantly looks to God for hope. So.
Well, let's land here on these last tranche of questions about your move to England and your book. So how did you end up here?
Well, first of all, I was invited. I was invited by Pete Greig, who's the leader of 24/7 Prayers. So those of you who don't know, 24/7 Prayer is an international movement that resources and catalyzes prayer, serves the church, the body of Christ globally in that. And so I had gotten to know Pete because we were a prayer community, and as we were trying to figure out how to be a prayer community, we began to look to 24/7 Prayer for resources on how to do that. And so that then a relationship formed, and I got kind of pulled into the swirl. And so Pete invited me to come to Waverley Abbey. They wanted to develop a house of prayer here, a modern monastery. And so I remember I was telling the story this morning to the staff here about how he kind of walked me through the fields and we looked at the ruins, and he's like, this is where your refectory will be, and this is where your chapel will be. And I'm like, yeah, it was a big sales pitch. I'm like, yeah, I don't know about that, Pete, because I had no inclination. I was happy where I was. And for me, I think there's, the transformation of communities does not happen in a week or a month or a year. If you're going to measure transformation of communities, you've got to use decades as a measurement. And so I was only a decade and a half in, and I was just starting to see the shift. And I'm like, oh no, it's just getting good. I don't want to go. And then just had through, and I won't, this long story of just these interruptions, really, where it became clear to myself and to my husband that yes, Pete had invited us, but ultimately, more importantly, God was inviting us. And this whole order of the mustard seed thing. I mean, when I joined the order, our vows are to be true to Christ, kind to people, take the gospel to the nations, and they sort of trip off of your tongue. And I'm like, yeah, gospel to the nations, yeah, whatever. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, oh no, you meant actually the gospel to the nations, and I actually had to leave my nation and go to another one, which actually we use the UK as a launching pad into Europe through 24/7 prayer. And so so that's, it just became clear. We sort of did what's so funny, I did when Kirk and I did it together, but my discernment took about a year and a half. Kirk's discernment happened in a minute, because we were looking at Google Maps of Guildford and Surrey, and we had to laugh. We thought Google was being really lacked humility, because it said Surrey Hills, area of outstanding beauty. And we didn't know that that's an actual land designation.
An official designation.
We just thought that Google was like bigging itself up.
Right.
So we would just mock it. The area of outstanding beauty. Yeah. Anyway, and we were looking at Google Maps of the area, and all of a sudden Kirk started to laugh. And I'm like, what? And he didn't tell me. A week later, he finally fessed up, and he said, oh, when we were looking at the map, he said, God spoke to me. And he said, you're going, right? And that's all it took. He just got that one word, and he's like, okay, let's pack the bags, ready? I was like, what? No, longer discernment. So he's I think the thing I love about him, and I'm so grateful for him, is that every time God has asked him to do a hard thing, and there have been many over the over 2 decades of our marriage, he's always said yes. He's always said yes. And many of the things have been extremely difficult and extremely costly, and he keeps saying yes. So, so we arrived 2 years ago. We actually flew out of Canada on our 20th wedding anniversary. We thought, let's just launch ourselves into the next decade of our lives together by flying to the UK. And we landed and just started laying the groundwork for this project in this community. Worked with 24/7. I also work part-time at Pete Greig's church in the area of prayer and spiritual formation. And here we are. So I'm learning how to speak English.
Yeah, you said you're learning the.
I'm still learning,
and it's
and learning how to drive
on the correct side of the road. And the thing I come across a lot with my North American friends is the quick realization that the suspicion that English say something but they mean something else. Like when they say we really should do this again, actually means let's make sure we never do this again. Or that was really nice equals that's the worst thing I ever took part of. How was the prayer meeting? It was really, really nice. I mean, it was the worst thing I ever did. And we've got British irony. Any other? And you've already mentioned you notice we're not so good at Lament. Any particular other quirks that you've noticed in your 2 years?
I think one of the areas where I think we have work to do, and I in particular am working on, is particularly in this part of England. It appears to me as an outsider looking in that you guys have enculturated your women to be quiet. And if a woman steps with any kind of boldness into a space, this killer phrase, oh, she's a little bit tricky. That's like the death phrase, right? And so there's this enculturation of not rewarding initiative, entrepreneurialism, boldness in women in leadership. And so actually I really held back quite a lot in certainly my first year and a half, because I didn't want to be the obnoxious North American. And I remember hearing secondhand. I was talking with somebody at the 24/7 office about before I moved here about something I wanted, and the person said to another person in the office, I heard it later, like, she's pretty strong. And it was and so for I think that I would love to see women empowered to be more courageous in this space. And so I am trying to create all kinds of room for women to be as bold as they can be in the authority that we have in Jesus, and the safety that we have in spiritual family, or that we should have. So yeah, so that's a piece of work that I'm leaning into.
Thank you. Sometimes I have found myself over the years never with Canadians or with Americans, the best compliment I can give them is they say, where's so and so from? I say, from America, but you wouldn't know it.
Yeah.
There's that English aversion to brash bravado.
Yeah. Well, there's blagging, and then there's real boldness.
They're very
right,
different.
And there's real confidence, and they're different things. And I mean, I've also learned how to say things sideways. So I learned how to talk around things, so I could fit in and I can enculturate. But there's sometimes when you need to just say it full on. And so it helps that I'm quite good at body language.
Right.
So their lips might be saying one thing, but their body's saying something else. So I just read the body, and then I know what's going on.
Well, let's wrap up with your book, which we've already drawn from, but Even the Sparrow, so beautifully written. Can you tell us why you wrote it, and how did it end up being 40 short chapters as you wrote it?
Yes, I wrote it. I went to a writing group. I was in a workshop, and we went up and down the aisles, and they asked everybody to say, why do you write? And people would say, well, I love words, I love to read, I'm a creative person. And I blurted when it came to me. And it was, when you say something like really true that you weren't planning to say, I just said legacy. And I'm turning 50 this year, in case you didn't do the math when I told my birth. But for me, I'm very interested in the next generation of young leaders, all young leaders, but particularly female leaders. And so I think there comes a point in Moses' life where he has to gather a group of people around him and impart the spirit that he carries to them. This is that moment for me, and this is the way I chose to do it. And so legacy.
Great. Now, writers often, if you read about them and their practices, they have sort of little liturgies, including coffee shops as a common one. What times a day they were writing? What were yours, Jill, to get the book written?
Times of day. I had a certain routine. I would get up, I would do my prayer, and then I'd head off to a local coffee shop. I would always order the same coffee. I had my same table. We had two regular guys. It was me and two old guys. We're always there every morning, and I got to know them over the time. And I would put my timer on for an hour and a half a day, and then often I would write at the top of the page: write what you know, write what you don't know, find your voice. And then I would go. And so I have to, I'm in a different season right now and finding new rhythms in this new environment. And I just signed my book contract for my next book. And so I'm like, okay, Lord, you're just going to have to show me the new rhythm for this new season, because now I'm committed. I've signed the contract. So And so that's yet to be revealed, but I'm quite hopeful that I'll settle into that routine soon.
Yeah, well, this is my last question. We landed on nicely. Do you have any other new projects? So you do another book. What's the focus for this? What are you hoping that this book
Well,
will be about?
yeah, I think my genre is memoir, spiritual memoir. I think that, I think I am a part of my work in the world is being a spiritual formation educator, and I think that the way that I can best do that is through story, and particularly when I think of my target audience, which would be millennials and younger. Story is the way in, really, and to just let the story speak. So and so I am zooming in on the period of time from when I got pregnant to when my daughter was just a few years old, because and to explore the. I was talking to a young mom a couple of weeks ago, and she said, God has never so aggressively shaped and formed me than he has in this season of being a stay-at-home mom in the early years. And I think for me, I see a lot of young women, step out of the work world, and it's there's lots that happens in that time, and there's a lot of fear of missing out, that you're going to miss the career track, you're going to miss whatever it is. And there have been a couple of times where I posted on social media about actually how God shapes and forms us uniquely as women in those seasons. And I've had a tremendous response from readers, and realized that there are young women out there that need to understand the purposes of God in terms of how he's shaping and forming them. So I'm calling it momastery. And so, but then part of the project as well is not going to be capturing my own story, but we're going to start a momastery podcast so that other mothers can talk about how God is. And it's not about how to be a good mom. It's not parenting techniques. It's actually, what is God doing? How is he shaping you in this season? It's a unique season. So, so we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Right. Well, Jill, thank you for all this time and for all the questions. Thank you for your amazing book, and thank you for just the way that you let us have a little peek under the hood, some more into your life and what makes you and what's happening. So thank you so much, and all the best with the new book and the new podcast.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences, and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.